if you are looking to purchase your first property, I'm going to break down what those expenses are going to look like so that you can be prepared going forward. So today we're going to use the example of a $500,000 condo. I know condo may not be your first choice, but that is currently what it's going to cost to get into the market at the very, very entry level. If you want something less than $500,000, is it possible? Yes, but you're going to have to leave Toronto to get there. So we will talk about a $500,000 condo. So let's get started here. So at $500,000 purchase price, there's a minimum down payment that is required, and that down payment is 5%. So we need 5% of 500,000, which is 25 grand. That is your minimum required down payment for the $500,000 purchase. This is not the end of what it's going to cost you to buy your first property, though. There are other things we need to consider, one of which is your land transfer tax, so LTT here. And your land transfer tax is going to have a couple different aspects to it. The first aspect is, are you buying outside of Toronto or are you buying in Toronto? Let's say we're buying outside of Toronto. Your land transfer tax is at $500,000, $64.75. Now, let's say we are not buying in Toronto and you're a first-time home buyer. Beautiful. First-time home buyer, you get a $4,000 credit. So we're going to take off $4 grand here. Keep in mind, we're not talking Toronto, so $24.75 is your additional land transfer tax and what that's going to have to come out of pocket. This needs to be paid at the lawyers on or before closing, so you need to have an additional $24.75 on top of your $25,000. That's not where it stops. Let's say, did you buy this in Toronto? Maybe. You have to times this by 2. So you're going to have to pay double land transfer tax if you bought it in Toronto. So you're talking about $5,000 if you're buying your first property in Toronto. Now, this is only if you bought your first house. Imagine you didn't buy your first house. This was your second property. Maybe it's an investment property. Now, this $4,000 rebate is gone. So you're no longer at $24.75 unless it's your first property. You are at $64.75 outside of Toronto postal code. If you have a Toronto postal code, once again, you're multiplying this by 2, so you're at about $13,000 just in land transfer taxes. Now, that's not the end as well. When you're talking closing the deals, the realtors do the paperwork to have the transaction firm, binding, but we need lawyers to make sure the deal closes. So your lawyer fees, generally, we will say roughly $2,000 additional dollars for the lawyers to close the transaction. And then there are some miscellaneous charges. You're going to have your moving expenses. You're going to possibly have to pay back some of the property tax that the current owner has already prepaid if that's something that they've already done. Now, they're going to have to get a credit for that because that's already on file for the property. These are just a few of the additional expenses that you need to anticipate when it's coming time to buy your first house, or even if you're buying your second house and you forgot how the process goes and what needs to come out of pocket. So if we're going to just use these numbers here, we've got $25,000. If we're a first-time home buyer, it's an additional $2,400 and an additional $2,000 for lawyers. So you do need about $30,000 just to purchase your first property if you're a first-time home buyer outside of Toronto. Now, if it's in Toronto, obviously we're going to multiply this here by 2, or this number here if it's not your first property. Buying a home is not as easy as one may think, and it's not as cut and dry as the numbers may seem a lot of the time until you see them on paper. Now, what I want to do here is get into a different scenario. We're going to change the number of your purchase price because that does change how your down payment actually works. All right, so let's say we purchased a property for $800,000. The down payment structure works differently in this case. So we have your $25,000, which is for your first 500 grand in your purchase price, because the minimum here is 5% down payment. Anything above and beyond 500 grand, you actually have to have a minimum of 10% down payment. So we have a remaining $300,000 to get our total of 800 grand. And this portion, 300 grand, has to be 10%. So we need $30,000. as our actual down payment for that remaining portion. So if you're buying something for $800,000, your bare minimum that you're able to put as your down payment is $55,000. So the moment you surpass that $500,000 threshold, you're talking about a 10% down payment that is due upon the difference. First 500 grand, 25,000, anything beyond that, 10% of. So this can really change how much money you do need. Now we've run into it a couple times where a client has come to us with their approvals from the bank, they're ready to start looking at houses, but they may not have had the proper education from whoever was dealing with them on the mortgage side of things. They didn't understand that you needed the difference above 500 grand to be 10% for your down payment. They thought it was just 5% across the board. Now think, $1 million, 5%, $50,000. That is not the case. If you are buying something for $1 million, you are going to have $85,000 as your down payment. So we had a shortfall of a huge amount of cash. So we had to actually postpone the buying process. So it really is important that you understand buying a home and the way it works, how the numbers actually come together. And that way, when you do want to buy your first house, you understand where this money needs to go. You're not throwing your hands up in the air thinking that I thought I was going to end up with more money in my pocket at the end of the day, when the reality is it's a large sum of money that you need to purchase your first property. Now, before we end that video here, keep in mind most people can't afford more than $1 million for their first property, but if you're buying your first property over $1 million, even if it's one penny, the minimum down payment required is 20%. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this was informative and helpful for you, I'd love it if you liked, comment, and shared. And if you're looking to buy your first house, hit me in the comment section down below. Let me know where you are looking for your first house, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.